Hi everyone, my name's Eleanor and I'm the Education Manager at Benjamin Franklin House. Welcome to this, our second virtual class in our new history series. And we're really excited you can join us today. I can see we've got some more hellos coming in the chat. So from Stella and Lily, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. So you're actually demonstrating one of the ways you can participate today. We're really looking forward to receiving your questions and to trying to answer them as well. So there are two main ways you can do that. You can either use your raise hand button and then I can unmute your microphone and you can ask or answer your question over the audio, or you can write your question or answer in the chat. We are recording today's class, so if you're actually watching this on our website or on YouTube, then when it comes to the questions I'm going to be asking you, you might want to pause the video and just think about your answer or tell it to the person you're watching with. And if you have any questions at all, you can always send me an email to education@benjaminfranklinhouse.org. So I can see we have some raised hands, but I'm just going to introduce the class and then I'll come back to questions and comments as well. So today we're going to be looking at the topic of society and class in the Georgian period, but I can see we have some new names joining us, which is great. So I'm going to quickly start by introducing our main man, Benjamin Franklin, and the house he lived in as well. So on the screen, on the left, you can see an image of Benjamin Franklin, and then on the right, an image of the house he lived in for almost 16 years here in London, which is on Craven Street, right in the centre of the city. So I wonder if in the chat, you might be able to put anything you know already about Benjamin Franklin and what he's really known for. What are the reasons that we remember Benjamin Franklin? Okay, I can see some raised hands, so let me see if anyone would like to tell us some things about Benjamin Franklin. Hi, Enid.
Hi, I wanted to say that Benjamin Franklin invented something kind of like the piano that you can still play today.
Yeah, thank you so much. So that's actually helping us answer a question that's come in about what he's doing in the picture. I'll come back to that. Others have mentioned that he flew a kite into lightning. He was on he's on one of the dollar bills in America. Fantastic. So he was known for lots of things. He began his life as a printer and a writer, but later became a scientist and inventor with his lightning rod and his glass harmonica, which is what he's playing in this picture here. This is a musical instrument he invented when he was living at Craven Street in London. And if you are ever able to come and visit us once we reopen, then you'll be able to see and maybe even play. We have a modern replica of the glass harmonica that you might be able to see when you come. So he was famous for all those things, but perhaps particularly for his politics. And he became one of the US founding fathers. So, and this was the main reason he came to London in 1757 and stayed here for almost 16 years up until 1775. He was representing America, or what was known then also as the colonies. And this was all before, in the years leading up to what would become the American Revolution or the War of Independence, when America broke away and became its own country. So the house he lived in, which you can see on the right on Craven Street, was built at the beginning of the Georgian period, around 1730. And when Benjamin Franklin was living there, it was under the reigns of King George II and then King George III. And if you missed our first class on Georgian kings and queens, then you can catch up on that on our website or our YouTube channel. So I can see that we have some questions, so I'll go to those before we move on.
When Georgian society and class was very tough back then, very different from our class today. It would take hundreds and hundreds of years to get to a higher class, and it was really tough. We still find it hard getting to a higher class today, and it was really, really tough because, for example, if women didn't marry back then, they could have been very, very poor.
Very good, exactly. Thank you so much. You've just anticipated my next slide, which is going to be asking the question about our topic today. So it's really important we understand the terms we're using. So I wonder if anyone has an idea already of what I mean by exploring Georgian society and class. So Clyde's given us an idea there. I wonder if anyone would like to add anything. Okay. Hello, is that Philippa?
Yes.
What would you like to add about society and class, what those words mean?
Well, does the society mean like kind of a group of like something?
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic.
And then class,
yeah.
And then class is like a group when you learn about things, but it's different to society because I think like they do experiments instead of like learning maths.
Thank you. You're on the right track. So society is a group of people who normally live together in a kind of organized way. They might make decisions together about how things should be run, and they share out the work that needs to be done between them. So we talk about societies in most countries and in sometimes groups of countries. So like British society, for example. That word also gets used when we're talking about high society. So that might be the part of society that has the people who are most rich and powerful and fashionable. So we'll come back to that too. Now, you were talking about the meaning of class where it's a kind of like what we're doing now, we're learning together, but there's another meaning of class as well. Claire has mentioned that your class is the position in which you live life. So it reflects how much you own and how rich you are. That's definitely part of it. So your class is, different classes will be groups of people within society who come from a similar economic, so have a similar amount of money, or also kind of social position. So we're going to explain more about that in a moment. And to help us understand this, we're going to think back to last week's class when we were using timelines to help us understand the chronology of history. Because to really understand society and class in the Georgian period, it's useful to think about what came before and what came after. Can anyone remind us what that word chronology means when we're thinking about history? I can see a raised hand. Brilliant. Thanks so much for all the participation. Hello.
It means the order of things of which things happen.
Brilliant. Thanks. Great explanation. So that the time order in which things happen, and Claire has put that in and Helen have put that in the chat too. Brilliant. Thanks so much, everyone. Okay. So now, remember, we're going to be thinking about what came before, what came after. So the Georgian period is mainly 18th century. So if we think a bit before to the 16th century, and last week we were thinking about all the kings and queens in England. So in the 16th century, that was mainly when it was the Tudors, so people like Queen Elizabeth. And life was very different then to now and to the Georgian period. So in the 16th century, about 90% of the population in England lived in the countryside. So most of society worked around land and farming. So here we have this kind of pyramid, and right at the top, it's not labeled, but would be the king or the queens or the monarchy. And then you have the nobility and the gentry who own land, and then yeomen who own some land, but not a large amount. And then the people who have to be employed working, they don't have their own property themselves. So this was most of society in the 16th century. There was a smaller number of people living in cities, and they would have had a slightly different structure, but for most of the population, this was the kind of social structure and the different classes. And then there was a lot of change over the Georgian period, over the 18th century. So one of the things that started happening is a lot more people moved to cities, and the population in cities really, really grew. And the population of the country in general grew. So in 1700, there were about 5 million people in Britain, and then by 1801, there was nearly 9 million. So it had almost doubled the population. And part of this, the reason for this move to cities was because of the Industrial Revolution that we spoke about last time. So this is the fact that there were lots more factories, and because of that, there were lots of skilled jobs that people needed to do. And so because of this, something developed which we call the middle class. So before it was more lower and upper classes, but then really the Georgian period was the time when the middle classes grew and people could learn a trade or a skill and have lots more different jobs from that. And then so on the right of the screen, we're thinking after the Georgian period, when all of those different professions have been established. So this is quite a famous illustration. It's a caricature from the 19th century. So remember, that's the Victorian period when Queen Victoria was on the throne. And it belongs at the British Museum. And it shows, it's a very complicated diagram of all the different parts of society. And it's showing that by that time, you could really, your class and status really reflected your profession, your job, more so than the family you were born into. And in the hive, you have the royal family still at the top, then you have the politicians in parliament, and then professions like lawyers and judges, and then the clergy, vicars, and the military. And then it goes down the middle classes, lots of skilled professions. So things like working as booksellers or mechanics or weavers. And then at the bottom, it's jobs where it's less skilled, you need less training to do. So things like shoe blacks and people who moved coal and people who were chimney sweeps too. So that's kind of either side of the Georgian period. And as I said, there was so much change in this time. And so land was no longer the only source of wealth like it had been before, and people were a bit more in charge of their own destiny with this growth of the middle classes. So I'm not going to go through all the levels of the beehive that's shown here, but the main three groups that Clive was mentioning are the lower class, the middle class, and the upper class. So we're going to talk a bit about all three of those, and then I'll see if anyone's got any questions. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about the upper classes. Here we go, and I've got some images to illustrate as well. So the upper classes were also referred to as the gentry, and they had control over most of the resources in the country. So they still owned a lot of the land and had a lot of wealth, most of which was inherited, so passed on from their ancestors. And so most of that wealth and the financial assets would be inherited by just the eldest son. And then the younger sons would have to find work, but there were certain jobs that were approved for the upper classes that were seen to be respectable enough. So thinking about what I mentioned in regards to the beehive, I wonder if anyone has any ideas of what jobs might have been acceptable for those younger sons in the upper class. What do you think? Hi, Clive.
Well, thank you. I think that, to be honest, very, very hard jobs like scientists or something like that, which was to do with how we live now, maybe scientists.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's so scholars, that was definitely on the list. Someone in the chat mentioned politicians, that's quite right. Also the military and clergy and so vicars, and would have been allowed as well. Also medicine too, so doctors. So things that needed quite a lot of study and training. Now, right at the beginning of the class, Clive mentioned how life could be quite difficult for women, and that's true. Even upper class women, life could be quite limited. So for many, their education would be limited to learning things that would help them to find their husband. So maybe learning to play beautiful music, learning how to dance, and then also how to run a household. Although some women did seek more education depending on their families, but for the majority, their education would be quite limited. And we'll come back to that in our next class when we're thinking about children and families. And then, so often their weddings would be almost like a business transaction. It would be quite important for the families to make good connections and to increase their wealth and status through these marriages too. Laura has mentioned dowries. So exactly when a woman would marry, she would have a dowry. So it was quite transactional and could be quite difficult for young women. So in the picture, we can see one of the pursuits of the upper classes. So this is an amazing, very lavish ball at court. Got all of those candles illuminating the beautiful architecture. Candles would have been quite expensive in those days. So there's a real extravagance in all those, having all those candles. And then the amazing clothes. And I've got a picture from the Fashion Museum in Bath of this very special dress. This is a mantua dress, which was in fashion in the 1750s and 60s. And it was to really show off all of that fabric that was used. Women were almost like walking art displays. And you can imagine it was quite uncomfortable. There was a whole kind of pannier cane basket underneath the skirt. And women had to turn around sideways to be able to walk through doorways and things. So very lavish styles. Phoebe said the dress is really big. You're quite right, and I don't think it would have been very comfortable. It is also beautiful, and so if you went to the website of the Fashion Museum of Bath, also the V&A and Victorian Albert Museum has some amazing examples, and you can get a closer look at the really detailed embroidery and patterns on the dress. So I can see we have some more hands up. I'll just go to those, and then we'll move on to the middle classes.
I don't think women were allowed to vote in that time because they thought men were more powerful than women, and so men were allowed to vote, but not women.
You're quite right. That's really important. So as I said, life was really restricted for women. They couldn't vote, and men had all the property. So remember, I said only the eldest son would inherit. So if a family had no sons, then the property would go to the closest next male relative. So really quite difficult for women in those times. Very importantly, has said not all men could vote either. So you're quite right, and it was quite linked to whether you owned land and things. So it was quite a small section of society that could vote. Brilliant, so much great participation. I'll come back to raise hands so we can move on to the middle classes. As I said, this was really something that grew a lot in Georgian times. So we've got these images here to illustrate it, but let me tell you a bit more about them. So as I said, it was linked to the growth in the population and the movement towards cities and towns, partly linked to the Industrial Revolution. So remember that started in around 1760 and then carried on until 1820 to 1840. And it really changed the whole of society. And there are all these factories and lots more different trades and jobs that were needed. So there were opportunities to train, and because all these positions were needed, then the training had to be provided. So a lot of people could complete apprenticeships and then kind of work their way up. So as we said, rather than just being born into wealth and a certain position in society, you could really, it was easier in some ways to a certain extent to change your position in society. And so the middle classes were somewhere between upper and lower classes. Women would probably still work, but they wouldn't perform those menial tasks we talked about. So they'd be work that required some more level of skill and training. So in these images here, we have a bookshop. So this is something else that really exploded in the Georgian period, kind of consumerism. So a lot more people shopping. And because we have these middle classes that had some money to spend, and for the middle classes, they might not be able to afford really grand clothes or really grand houses, but they would like to show the wealth they'd earned through their clothes and their objects, their furniture as well. There was more mass-produced furniture and things like crockery that you'd eat, your plates and cups and things. So the middle classes like to use that as a display of their status. So not on the same level as the upper classes, but they still like to show their status. And we've got a picture on the right here that's from the London Metropolitan Archives, and it shows the Kensington Garden fashions for June. So you can see these fashions are, this is a bit later than the one before. This would be in the kind of Regency period, so in the early 1800s. But you can see there's still quite a lot of details. So all of the decorations on the hats and the different layers, the parasols. So not quite as over the top as some of the upper class clothes, but still smart and following the fashions as well. And they might not use quite such expensive materials as the upper class clothes as well. I can see we've got some hands up, so let me go to those. Hi, Enid.
Hi. I would say that they are still a little bit of a show off.
Right, yeah, exactly. So they still wanted to really show that money they worked hard to earn as well. Thank you. Okay, so now let's think about the lower classes. Right, so right at the beginning, I've mentioned life being very hard, and this was particularly true for the lower classes. Life could be really a struggle. Often it would be a struggle to have enough food to eat, enough money to eat. So throughout the period, there was some trouble with the grains, with the harvest, and so the price of bread could really go up and down. And so sometimes people would really struggle to earn enough money to even have those basic needs like shelter and food. And so the lower classes wouldn't really have any property or resources they could fall back on if they got sick or elderly, or if other things like that happened. So because this was a problem, and there was charity, so mostly churches were in charge of giving out support to the poor. But then also in the beginning of this period, around 1720, they started building something called poorhouses because of the poor law. And these were kind of workhouses, so the lower classes would have shelter and they'd be fed and clothes, but they would have to work really hard. So we've got a picture of one on the left. It's a kind of wash house, a kind of laundry. And there was quite a big variety in these poorhouses. So some were better conditions, and there might be some education that would happen, and some healthcare as well. But some were really not good conditions, particularly in London, where it was such a crowded population, and it had grown so rapidly that the city hadn't really caught up and hadn't put in all of the things that were needed to for sanitation, and so there was a lot of disease, and it could be a really difficult situation. So in these workhouses, it would be those menial tasks we're talking about. So, for example, laundry, fixing things. So they could be quite tough places to be. And some people chose, rather than going into the workhouses, to try and do what got referred to as kind of begging trades. So trades we mentioned, like blacking shoes and sweeps, but would be able to make enough of a living that way. And you can see that the on the right, the clothes for the poor, this is more someone in the countryside, were much simpler. They had to be much more comfortable and easy to move in for that hard work, and much less about the fashions than the ones we've seen before. Okay, well, I've got a question for you, and it's a big one. So remember, in these classes, we're learning kind of the knowledge of the period, but we're also thinking about some really important historical skills. So my question for you is, how do historians find out about the lives of people from the past? How do they find that out? What do they use? I can see lots of comments in the chat, so brilliant. So we've got, someone has mentioned archaeologists, someone's mentioned books, diaries, paintings. Fantastic. And we've got some hands up as well. So let me see if anyone would like to add anything. Hello, is that Philippa?
They also used stuff called DNA to find out how they looked like, what type of hair they had, if they had brown or blue eyes. Yeah, so now we can use more science to help us, so that's definitely something that we're using more and more as well. Let me go to Stella. Hello.
Hi. A lot of times they would use tools or sometimes books that they found all around the place, like in Pompeii, for instance.
Yeah, so the objects they find, the everyday objects. Fantastic answers, everyone. Hi, Enid.
Hi. I was thinking that maybe it would be writing and letters and maybe like pictures of dresses.
Yeah, absolutely, all those things. And someone's mentioned the buildings, the architecture of the buildings too. So many fantastic answers, everyone. Thank you. So you've mentioned a lot of things, and we call all those things you've mentioned primary sources. So things that were actually created at the time, whether it's the objects or the writing or the artwork. So I'm going to show you some examples of those so that we can see just how they're so helpful to us. So the first example I wanted to show you was a letter, like Ina just mentioned. So here we have a letter. Now, these sources are all from the British Library, which is a fantastic resource. Someone asked in the Q&A earlier, a good website to find out more about history. The British Library has amazing articles and also all these original primary sources that you can have a closer look at. So here we have a letter from a lady called Frances Burney. So you've got a portrait of her on the right. This is a portrait painted by her brother. And she was kind of upper middle class. So she, her parents were musicians and her father was also a scholar. And she was quite a very special and unusual lady. So she was more educated than some women were, as we were talking about. And she actually ended up writing some books, famous books called Evelina and Cecilia and Camilla. And originally she published them, they were novels, and novels weren't too respected yet at that time. And originally she published them without putting her name on them, but then they were very popular. So she eventually revealed that it was her. And she worked for a time as the keeper of the robes, which is a special position in the court, so for the king and queen. And she eventually married quite late a Frenchman and lived in France for a while as well. So she had a really interesting life. And this letter is one that she wrote to a good friend called Samuel Crisp, who was a playwright who wrote plays. And she writes lots of interesting things in it. It tells you all about, it's quite a lot of personal opinions, and so what life was like for her and how she felt about things. And in this particular letter, thinking about things we've been discussing today, she kind of defends her decision. She turned down 2 proposals of marriage, then marrying later eventually. But she kind of defends that decision, and she says, I'll quote from the letter, that she has no idea why the single life may not be happy. Liberty is not without value with women as well as with men. So the letters can tell us a lot, not just about what everyday life is like, but how it might have felt to be in those different classes of society. And indeed, a lot of what we know about Benjamin Franklin comes from his letters. If you're ever interested, all of his writing, his letters and other things has been digitized. So if you type in the Franklin Papers, you can look through them, you can search by keywords, so you can see what Benjamin Franklin thought about all sorts of things. Okay, so we have letters. Now, we learned a lot from Fanny Burney, especially, for example, from her time in court. Not only did she write letters, but she wrote something else that's already been mentioned, a kind of private sort of writing that can be very useful for historians. I wonder if anyone knows what it would have been. This kind of private type of writing. Got some raised hands, that's fantastic. Hi, Philippa.
They would use diaries to find out like what their days were like.
Yes, sorry, exactly. Find out what their days were like, exactly. So let me show you a diary now. So also from the British Library, we've got the diary of Francis Place. So there's a picture of him on the right. And Francis Place was very much in the middle classes. So he lived his whole life around Charing Cross and the Strand, so just where Benjamin Franklin House is today. And he started off as an apprentice to a breeches maker, and eventually became a very successful tailor, so making clothes. And he's remembered today for his diaries, which are so useful to historians. He also had strong political opinions. So we've talked a bit today about voting and not being able to vote. And he believed that more people should vote, also that everyone should have an education, and that people should have trade unions for where they work. So some very interesting ideas. And in this entry we have here, he describes what it's like in the street outside his window, looking out there one fine morning. So I have an extract that I'll read you in a moment, so you can see the level of the description and how well it kind of creates the scene. So it says, the people in the street were variously grouped: workmen, market people with baskets of fruits and flowers on their heads, or on their donkeys, or in their small carts, numbers of others with vegetables, newsmen and boys running about to sell their papers to coach passengers. So you can see how it's so descriptive, and it really creates a picture of what it was like on the streets around Charing Cross. I wonder if anyone wants to add anything. Hello?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I think that there weren't any cars around and there were just horses pulling carts for people.
Yeah, exactly. And this extract from the diary shows us that, because that's what he means when he says selling the papers to the coach passengers. That would have been a coach with horses, exactly. So this was Thursday, 25th of July, 1827, so towards the end of the Georgian period. Now we're going to look at some primary sources that tell us about life of the working class, but there isn't so much writing directly made by members of the lower working classes. Does anyone know why that might have been? Why do they think that might be the case, that we have less writing? Hi, Sarah.
I think maybe because they couldn't afford the diaries or paper.
That's one reason. Thank you. It's expensive to have all those of that equipment, of the paper, for example. Exactly. And let me see. Hello, is that Bronwen?
That they couldn't read or write.
Right, very important. A lot of them couldn't read or write. So there was some teaching, charitable teaching through churches and in the workhouses, but most of the lower classes wouldn't have been able to read or write. So we don't have as much writing from them directly. So we use other things. So like some people have mentioned already, things like artwork and also different publications. So the Georgian period was also a time when publishing really took off, and there was a lot more of that. So on the left, again, these amazing resources from the British Library. So we've got an illustration of the workhouse at St James's Parish. Remember, a lot of them were connected with churches. And you can see that it's fairly crowded. It's not as crowded as some of them would have been, and it's quite dark. And all of these, mainly women in here, and a lot of them are working at mending kind of materials and things. And you can see it's very simple, just these sort of quite uncomfy looking wooden benches and things. So it gives us a sense of the atmosphere. And then on the right, we have an account of workhouses in Great Britain. So this is writing that was really useful in describing it. It went through different workhouses in different parts of the country and described what they were like. So this is from 1786. And from that, we know that it really could be in certain places quite bad conditions, not enough food, and that this very repetitive repetition of these menial tasks. But they did offer a way out of real hunger and homelessness and disease as well. Thank you. And hopefully you'll be able to join us for the next class, which is in 2 weeks' time. So it's Thursday, the 11th of February. So I'll just send the registration link in case you haven't signed up already. That's gone in the chat. We do hope you'll be able to join us. I can see we have a few more raised hands before we go. Hello.
Hi, I just really wanted to say that I really like this class and I think you did a great job.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, thank you to everyone who's had such great questions and taught me lots of things as well in their comments. I'll just come out of my PowerPoint now, and I do hope you'll be able to join us on the 11th of February. If you'd like to try an activity in between now and then as a kind of follow-up to the class, my suggestion would be to do some writing, try putting yourself in the shoes of the people in the Georgian period, and try writing your own diary entry. So you might choose to be an upper class lady or gentleman, describing those endless balls that they would go to and those difficult things they would wear, maybe having to turn sideways to get through the door in your mantua dress. You might choose to be one of the skilled members of the middle classes, like Francis Place, whose diary we saw, and you can read more about his diary at the British Library, on the British Library website. And then you might even choose to be one of the members of the lower class who was fortunate enough to get an education and describing the difficult conditions in the workhouse as well. So I hope you enjoy having a go at putting yourself in the shoes of the Georgians, and we hope to see you at the next class. Thanks everyone. Goodbye.